Night in rural Virginia carries a silence so heavy, it feels alive. The year is the early 1800s, the exact date lost to time. But the air remembers. Midnight has bled past. A crescent moon hides behind a sheet of storm clouds, leaving the land in a velvet darkness. Only the faint hiss of crickets and the rasp of a distant owl disturb the stillness. The camera glides low across endless rows of tobacco, each leaf glistening with dew like 1,000 dull knives. A breeze curls through the stalks, whispering secrets in a language older than the soil itself. Lanterns flicker in the distance, a stately manor at the center of a sprawling plantation. Its whitewashed walls glow pale against the black sky, a lonely beacon of wealth built on the backs of the enslaved. Inside, the household sleeps. The masters and their kin cushioned in feather beds. The enslaved, confined to their cramped quarters, lie restless, their dreams stalked by memories of lash and chain. The camera drifts closer, sound fading until only a single heartbeat remains, slow, deliberate, almost inhuman. A door creaks, a silhouette steps from the shadowed doorway of the smokehouse. Broad shoulders, steady hands. In one fist glints a butcher's cleaver, the steel catching the lantern light for a breath before darkness swallows it again. He does not hurry. His footsteps are soft, practiced. This is a man who has spent years studying the rhythm of this house, the timing of patrols, the squeak of every hinge, the places where the floorboards betray a person's weight. Tonight he moves like someone executing a plan rehearsed 1,000 times in silence. The wind dies. The heartbeat quickens. A sudden clang, iron against wood, echoes from the main house. A dog barks once, sharp and startled, then whimpers into silence. From the upper window, a candle flickers awake. A child stirs. A woman whispers, "Did you hear that?" Her husband mutters, dismissive, but the unease spreads like smoke. Downstairs, the front door groans open. Lantern light trembles across the hallway as the shadow enters. His face remains hidden, but his movements are methodical. He knows the path. A single scream slices the night. It is high, ragged, and cut short. The crickets fall silent. The camera does not linger on gore. It lingers on the sound, the thud of footsteps, the rasp of breath, the sharp metallic ring of a blade striking wood. Quick flashes. A cleaver raised, a shadow across a parlor wall, a drop of something dark sliding down a banister. Another scream. Then nothing. Outside, the fields remain still. The stars reappear as the clouds drift, casting a cold silver across the land. Smoke curls from a chimney that moments ago held only embers. The camera pulls back, rising above the house, showing the plantation as a single pale island in a black ocean of forest. From this distance, the violence inside seems almost impossible, as if the world itself has conspired to keep the night's truth a secret. A voice breaks the silence, low, deliberate, heavy with the weight of centuries. History remembers the masters. Their names are etched on deeds and tombstones. But tonight, the enslaved will write their own name in blood. The shot tightens again on the figure emerging from the front door. His clothes are streaked with shadow. The cleaver dangles at his side, glinting in the moonlight. He does not run. He walks into the darkness of the fields, a phantom disappearing into the endless rows of tobacco. The voice returns colder now, almost a whisper carried on the wind. His name was Isaac. They called him the Butcher. The screen fades to black. A final heartbeat echoes. Then, silence. Dawn breaks over Virginia with a deceptive beauty. Golden mist drifts through endless fields of tobacco and wheat, a tranquil canvas that hides a system of relentless cruelty. In the early decades of the 19th century, this state stood at the beating heart of America's slave economy. Its wealth was measured not only in acres or harvest yields, but in human lives. Men, women, and children bought and sold as property. A landscape of wealth and chains plantations stretched for miles along the tidewater rivers, each one a self-contained kingdom. From a distance, their columned mansions and manicured gardens could be mistaken for European estates. But the real engine of this prosperity lay behind the scenes. Hundreds of enslaved laborers forced to work from the first pink glow of sunrise until the last trace of light sank behind the trees. Owners counted these people the way merchants count coins. An able-bodied field hand might fetch $800, more than the price of many small farms. Ledgers list them like livestock, with notes about age, temperament, and breeding potential. Families were routinely torn apart at the auction block. The sound of a child wailing for a mother carried as far as the overseer's whip. Law and fear Virginia's legal codes ensured that this machinery of profit remained airtight. Black people, enslaved or free, could not legally assemble, testify against a white person, or learn to read. A whisper of rebellion could bring the harshest penalties: whippings, iron collars, even public execution. The state militia drilled with one eye on foreign threats and another on the possibility of uprisings at home. These laws were more than tools of control. They were instruments of terror. Overseers wielded them like a second whip. A single accusation of insubordination could mean 100 lashes. Runaways who were captured might be branded or have an ear cut off, a gruesome warning to others, a tide of rumors. And yet, despite this iron grip, the air in Virginia trembled with unease. The Haitian Revolution of the late 1790s, where enslaved people defeated European armies and claimed their freedom, haunted plantation owners like a waking nightmare. Closer to home, Gabriel's rebellion in 1800 and later whispers of Nat Turner's plans spread like sparks on dry grass. Every rustle in the dark fields, every unfamiliar song could be mistaken for the first sign of revolt. Enslaved communities nurtured these stories in hushed tones. Songs carried hidden messages, sermons doubled as strategy sessions. Hope, even in fragments, became a quiet act of resistance. Owners knew this, and their fear was constant. Night patrols roamed the woods. Lanterns burned late in the big houses. Still, the masters never felt truly safe. The world around Isaac, it was within this charged atmosphere that the man later called Isaac the Butcher lived and worked. His plantation, one of many scattered across Virginia's fertile lowlands, functioned like a prison camp disguised as a farm. Tall fences ringed the quarters. Armed riders patrolled the perimeter. The sound of iron on the blacksmith's anvil was as common as birdsong. Daily life blurred into a cycle of toil and punishment. Before dawn, an overseer's horn summoned the enslaved to the fields. Men bent their backs to the heavy, sticky tobacco leaves. Women hauled water, cooked in outdoor kitchens, mended the clothes of the very people who enslaved them. Children too young to work the fields carried kindling or shooed birds from the crops. At night, the weary retreated to wooden shacks barely fit for livestock. For the masters, the day ended in comfort, supper served on china, music played on imported pianos, conversations about markets and politics. But beneath their polite talk lay an unspoken dread. They knew the numbers. In many counties, enslaved people outnumbered their captors 2 or 3 to 1. The balance of power rested solely on violence and fear. Foreshadow of a storm from this volatile mix, oppression, rumor, and fragile control, came the conditions for revolt. Every law meant to suppress rebellion only sharpened the desire for freedom. Every act of cruelty planted a seed of vengeance. Isaac, a skilled butcher and smokehouse worker, lived in the shadows of this system. He listened, observed, and learned. In the rhythm of the overseer's rounds, he found patterns. In the whispered songs, he heard codes of defiance. The plantation was his cage, but also his classroom. Soon, that knowledge would ignite. Soon, Virginia's quiet dawns would give way to a night of reckoning. The story of Isaac, the man who would one day stride through a Virginia night with a butcher's cleaver, begins in shadows deeper than any single evening. Records of his birth are scattered, some lost, some never written. What survives is a collage of fragments. A boy delivered into bondage sometime near the turn of the 19th century, likely on a modest but profitable tobacco plantation a few miles from the James River. Born to chains, Isaac entered a world where his first cry belonged not to a mother's embrace, but to an owner's ledger. In Virginia, enslaved children inherited the status of their mothers. Freedom was not a birthright, but an impossibility stamped at the moment of arrival. Isaac's mother, remembered only as Dinah in a surviving bill of sale, is said to have been a field worker with a quiet strength, known for singing spirituals that floated across the rows of green tobacco. His father's name, if recorded, has long since vanished. Separation was the rule, not the exception. Many children were sold away before their first memories formed. Some accounts suggest Isaac was spared an early auction, perhaps because his small, sturdy frame promised a strong worker. Still, he grew up knowing that every sunrise could bring the sound of hooves and the finality of a gavel. Even as a child, Isaac observed the world with a stillness that unsettled overseers. He rarely spoke out of turn. He listened. He memorized the cadence of the bells that marked the day, the exact pitch of the hinge on the smokehouse door, the whistle a foreman used to signal a break. Older enslaved men whispered that he had wolf eyes, able to see patterns others missed. At night, while the quarters filled with low hymns and the sigh of exhausted bodies, Isaac lay awake. He watched the constellations trace their nightly march, imagining them as escape routes, as maps to some unseen freedom. But running required luck and allies he did not yet have. For now, he gathered knowledge like dry kindling. Apprenticed to the knife, when Isaac reached adolescence, the plantation's owner recognized a natural precision in the boy's movements and assigned him to the smokehouse. There, under the tutelage of an aging butcher known as Old Ben, Isaac learned the art of slaughter. It was grueling work, sharpening blades until they could split a hair, bleeding livestock with a single swift cut, carving flesh into marketable portions. To the owner, this was simply an efficient use of labor. To Isaac, it was an education in anatomy and discipline. He learned where sinew yields and where bone resists. He understood how a body's weight shifts in its final moments. And he learned to control his own breathing, to strike cleanly, without hesitation. The plantation folk began to call him the young butcher, at first as a simple description of his role. But even then, the name carried a darker resonance. There was something unnerving about the quiet youth who could reduce a hog to neat cuts with the calm of a surgeon. Bruises that never healed life in the smokehouse spared Isaac the blistering sun of the fields. But it did not protect him from the lash. Overseers punished infractions both real and imagined. A missed chore, a glance held too long, the faintest sign of defiance. Isaac bore the scars across his back like a secret map. One incident lingered in whispered recollection. A cousin, perhaps a sister, was sold south after a minor dispute with the mistress of the house. Witnesses said Isaac stood silent as the wagon creaked away, his jaw set, eyes fixed on the horizon long after the dust settled. From that day, those who knew him spoke of a change. The boy who once hummed Dinah's hymns worked in silence. He answered questions with a single nod. The wolf eyes grew colder. Lessons in resistance. Despite the cruelty surrounding him, Isaac absorbed the quiet strategies of survival from elders in the quarters. They taught him the double language of the enslaved, words that sounded like obedience but carried hidden meaning. He learned to braid messages into songs, to read the subtle shifts in an overseer's posture that foretold punishment. Some nights he ventured to clandestine gatherings in the woods, where traveling preachers fused scripture with whispers of liberation. There he heard tales of the Haitian fighters who had thrown off their chains and defeated mighty empires. He listened to stories of Gabriel's failed rebellion and of others who vanished into the great dismal swamp, free if only for a season. Each story was a spark, glowing in the dark recesses of his mind. A character forged. By his mid-20s, Isaac was a man both feared and overlooked. To the owners, he was valuable property, efficient, silent, reliable. To his fellow enslaved workers, he was a figure of quiet strength, a man who absorbed cruelty without breaking, who carried secrets no one could quite name. Those who met his gaze sometimes sensed an intensity that made them shift uneasily. He was not reckless. He did not shout slogans or court immediate danger. But there was an unmistakable gravity to him, as if he were a reservoir holding back a storm. Foreshadow of the butcher, the skills of the smokehouse, the scars of family torn apart. The nightly tales of uprisings, all these threads wove together to create the man who would one day earn a name that echoed in fear across Virginia. Isaac's life to this point was not merely survival, it was preparation. Every cut of the cleaver, every humiliation endured, every whispered hymn became part of a blueprint he never shared aloud. The world saw a butcher of animals. They did not yet see the man who would turn that knowledge upon the very system that trained him. The plantation seemed unchanged to casual eyes, same sweep of tobacco fields, same columns of pale smoke curling from the chimneys. But for Isaac, each passing season brought a deeper tremor beneath the soil. Years of endurance had hardened him. Years of observation had armed him. Now the smallest moments began to strike like sparks against dry tinder, whispers. After sundown by day, Isaac moved with the same quiet efficiency that had long shielded him. But after dark, when the overseer's lantern finally dimmed, the enslaved quarters came alive with a language outsiders could not decipher. Old women sang spirituals that bent scripture into veiled maps of freedom. Men tapped rhythms on their knees, the coded beats carrying across the humid air. Isaac listened. He rarely joined the chorus, but he memorized every pause, every inflection. He understood that these songs were not just prayers, they were instructions, a collective memory of roots, allies, and warnings. The Haitian Revolution, decades past, still haunted the imaginations of the oppressed. Stories of men who had fought and won against empires were repeated like sacred text. Each retelling lit a faint, smoldering hope. Daily humiliations, what the owners dismissed as discipline, was, to Isaac, a ledger of grievances written in welts. He witnessed a friend whipped for dropping a water bucket, an elderly woman forced to the ground because she paused to stretch her aching back. Children were struck for laughing too loudly. Then came the cruelty that cut deepest. Dinah, his mother, sold to a trader bound for the Carolinas. The mistress announced it with the casual finality of a shopping list. Isaac stood silent as a bill of sale replaced a lifetime of connection. That night he returned to the smokehouse and sharpened his knives long after the others slept. Sparks flew from the whetstone like tiny meteors, each one a silent vow. Patterns in the dark Isaac's years as a butcher had trained him to notice the smallest detail. Now he turned that focus toward the plantation itself. He studied the patrols of the night riders, marking when their horses clattered past the quarters and when fatigue slowed their circuit. He counted the steps that caused the main house's staircase to creak, the windows left unlatched for summer air, the precise moments when the overseer's voice dropped into drunken snores. He mapped escape routes in his mind. Through the smokehouse yard, along the creek bed where the mud muffled footsteps, into the thickets where dogs lost the scent. These were not idle fantasies. They were blueprints, allies, and coded promises. Though Isaac trusted few, he was not entirely alone. A field hand named Solomon, older and weathered, shared fragments of advice. Which abolitionist sympathizers lived beyond the river, how to read the moss on trees, where the militia stored gunpowder. Their exchanges were wordless more often than spoken. A glance at a moonlit path, a single tap of fingers against a barrel. Women in the quarters passed along scraps of news, a rebellion in Louisiana, a rumor of an underground network leading north. Each tale carried both warning and possibility. Isaac never declared his intentions, but the others sensed something gathering inside him. They gave him space, and when he walked by, conversations hushed like grass bending before a coming storm. A spark of violence. One summer evening, an overseer struck a young boy for dropping a hoe. The child's cry cut through the dusk like a blade. Witnesses remember Isaac standing nearby, cleaver in hand from the day's butchering, his knuckles white around the handle. He did nothing then, but those who caught his eye said it burned with a heat they could not name. That night, Isaac sat alone beneath the smokehouse eaves. The moon lit the edge of his blade as he honed it in slow, deliberate strokes. Each pass across the stone echoed like a heartbeat. The turning point accounts differ on the final catalyst. Some say the master threatened to sell another child from the quarters. Others whisper of a drunken assault against one of the women Isaac quietly protected. Whatever the truth, the moment came when endurance was no longer possible. Isaac began to gather supplies with a butcher's precision. Lengths of rope, small wedges of fat for silent hinges, a pouch of coarse salt to dry the sweat from his hands. Nothing outward changed in his routine. He slaughtered hogs, salted meat, delivered cuts to the big house as always. But inside, a clock had started its irreversible countdown. The calm. Before late that autumn, the plantation lay under a sky of hammered pewter. Frost silvered the tobacco stalks. Isaac moved through the chill dawn as though carved from the same hard metal. He had become an expert at invisibility. Owners and overseers saw only a compliant worker. Yet the quarters sensed it, the subtle stillness before a storm. When he passed, elders lowered their eyes, children fell silent, and even the night insects seemed to hold their breath. Whatever he planned, they knew it belonged to a realm beyond words, a space where survival and vengeance blurred. The seeds were planted, years of loss, decades of brutal discipline, the steady drip of humiliation that carves a canyon through the human spirit. All that remained was the night when those seeds would break open and spill their dark harvest across the Virginia soil. The day that would end in legend began without a whisper of warning. A thin winter sun climbed over the Virginia fields, pale and cold. Frost clung to the tobacco stubble like glass dust. Isaac moved through his chores as he always did, silent, deliberate, his heavy coat smelling of smokehouse salt. No one watching him could have guessed that the clock inside him had reached its final tick. By late afternoon, the air turned sharp. Overseers finished their rounds and the main house brightened with lamplight and laughter. From the quarters came the soft hum of a spiritual, half prayer, half signal, that floated toward the treetops and disappeared into the gray sky. Isaac sharpened his cleaver in the smokehouse, the whetstone rasping in a slow, steady rhythm. Sparks leapt, faded and died. He tested the blade with his thumb, not a tremor in his hand. The first step's night fell hard. Clouds smothered the stars, and the crescent moon sank behind the tree line. The plantation sank into its familiar darkness. Dogs curled near dying embers, lanterns guttered low, the overseer's heavy breathing sliding into a drunken snore. Isaac moved. A door eased open with barely a sigh. He stepped into the frozen yard, breath turning to mist. In his right hand hung the cleaver, wrapped in a scrap of cloth to dull its glint. Each footfall landed with the patience of a hunter. He crossed the yard, hugging the line of the smokehouse wall. The wind carried the faint scent of iron and tobacco. No alarm sounded. The quarters slept. Inside the house, the main door gave way with a soft click. Warm air and the smell of tallow candles drifted out to meet the night. Inside, the grand hallway stretched like the throat of some great beast. Stairs, rising in a slow curve toward the family's private rooms. Isaac paused, listening. A clock ticked in the parlor, a log settled in the hearth. Upstairs, someone coughed in their sleep. He climbed, each step chosen with a butcher's precision, careful to avoid the boards that groaned. The silence before what happened next would scatter into rumor and contradictory testimony. Some neighbors later swore they heard a single scream, others claimed the night stayed eerily still. What is certain is that the quiet of the plantation shattered, a crash of furniture, a cry that began as surprise and twisted into terror. Then another noise, low, heavy, final. The house erupted in confusion. Doors flew open. A lantern toppled, sending light spinning across the hallway walls. Shadows leapt like frantic birds. Fragments of the night witnesses later spoke of flashes. A cleaver glinting in the orange glow, a figure moving with uncanny calm. Footsteps, fast, then slower, then silence again. A dog barked once and went mute. Downstairs, glass shattered. Outside, the horses screamed and kicked in their stalls, their panic the only clear warning to neighboring farms. Whether minutes or an hour passed, no one could say with certainty. Time dissolved into a haze of smoke, screams and sudden stillness. a house of echoes. When the violence subsided, the great house seemed to exhale. Floorboards creaked in the settling heat, wind moaned down the chimney. Somewhere a clock continued its steady tick, oblivious. Isaac descended the staircase alone. Lantern light pooled around him, revealing nothing of his thoughts. His coat was dark, his expression unreadable. The cleaver swung loosely at his side, no longer wrapped. He crossed the threshold and stepped back into the frozen night. The yard lay hushed, the dogs silent as stone. The only sound was the crunch of his boots in the frost. Into the fields, he did not run. He moved through the rows of tobacco with the same measured pace he had practiced for years, a silhouette against the dim silver of moonlight breaking through the clouds. The plantation behind him, once a fortress of wealth and order, stood motionless, as if holding its breath. Some say he vanished into the woods before the alarm could spread. Others claim sympathetic hands hid him before dawn. A few insist the night itself swallowed him whole. Aftermath in the dark miles away, farmers and enslaved workers alike would later recall waking to the distant clang of a bell, the frantic hoofbeats of messengers, the first rumor of what had unfolded. But for the moment, only the cold Virginia earth bore witness. The camera of memory lingers on the empty fields, frost glittering like shards of broken glass. Over that stillness comes the echo of a single heartbeat, slow, deliberate, before fading into silence. First light. The first pale streaks of morning slid across the Virginia hills, touching the frost-hardened fields with a faint silver glow. For a heartbeat, the plantation looked almost peaceful, until the silence settled in a way that felt wrong. No rooster's crow, no clatter of early chores, only the brittle hiss of wind through frozen tobacco stalks. Neighbors would later recall that even the birds seemed to wait. Discovery. The overseer's wife was the first to stir. She wrapped a shawl tight against the cold and stepped from her cabin, expecting the usual smoke rising from the main house chimney. Instead, she saw doors yawning open and a lantern guttering weakly in the entryway. A single muddy footprint trailed across the porch boards. She followed it inside and froze. What she saw there sent her screaming into the yard, voice cracking the still morning like a rifle shot, alarm and confusion. The cry brought others running. Field hands, kitchen girls, neighboring farmers roused from their beds. They crowded the doorway, each one struck dumb by the scene beyond. Some crossed themselves, some whispered prayers, a few turned away, unable to look. Shouts echoed across the plantation as riders galloped off to summon the sheriff and local militia. Bells clanged in the distance. Dogs, late to the terror, finally began to bark, ragged, frantic, as if trying to chase back the night that had already passed. By mid-morning, the story raced along frozen roads, from farmhouse to tavern to county. Seat it traveled, each retelling sharper and stranger than the last. A slave uprising, a demonic possession, a ghostly visitation. Merchants abandoned their shops to hear the news. Farmers left fields, half-plowed, to gather at crossroads and speculate. Fear spread faster than fact. Was this a single act of vengeance, or the opening move in a larger rebellion? Sheriff Harlan rode in with 6 deputies, their breath pluming like smoke as they dismounted. Behind them came the county coroner, a preacher, and a handful of grim-faced volunteers clutching muskets. The overseer, pale and shaking, met them at the gate and led them to the house. Inside, they moved with the hushed efficiency of men who had seen violence before, but not like this. They catalogued the broken furniture, the splintered door frames, the scattered household belongings. The rooms smelled of tallow, cold iron, and something coppery beneath it all. Outside, a separate team began to scour the woods. Hounds sniffed, frozen earth, circling and whining at the edges of the forest, but never catching a clear trail. Isaac had vanished with the night, leaving only faint impressions in the frost that the morning sun quickly erased. Riders fanned out across the county, questioning travelers and scouring back roads. Every cabin, every thicket, every abandoned barn became a potential hiding place. But each search ended the same: nothing. By afternoon, the plantation was swarming with onlookers. Some came out of morbid curiosity, others brought food and blankets as if the dead might need comfort. Rumor turned into panic. Plantation owners tightened their patrols. Enslaved people were questioned, threatened, and chained. In town, a local newspaper rushed to print an extra edition, the headline screaming about the Butcher of Virginia. The name stuck before the ink dried. For those still bound to the soil, the day brought a new, harsher order. Chains were inspected, whips displayed like warning flags. Innocent men were dragged from their quarters, interrogated for hours, some beaten without cause. The fear of rebellion now outweighed any evidence. Yet among the enslaved there was another current, quiet, dangerous, unspoken. Some saw Isaac not as a villain, but as a man who had done what others only dreamed. As evening fell, the sheriff gathered his men for one last sweep before darkness returned. Torches bobbed like fireflies along the tree line, then faded one by one. The hounds lay exhausted. The plantation stood hollow, a house of echoes. Smoke drifted from hastily lit fires meant to ward off the chill, but no warmth could reach the cold that had settled in every heart. Long after the officials departed, neighbors claimed to hear strange sounds in the woods. A single bootstep on frozen leaves, the faint ring of steel, the low hum of a hymn carried on the wind. Whether real or imagined, those whispers fed a legend that would outlive every witness. Isaac's name, already turned to myth, traveled the length of Virginia by week's end. Some swore he had crossed the Appalachians and joined maroon communities in distant swamps. Others believed the earth itself had swallowed him, as if the night were keeping its own dark secret. Dawn after dawn, the riders set out again, their breath hanging like smoke in the brittle Virginia air. Sheriff Harlan led them with eyes that never seemed to blink, a man who had vowed to bring Isaac back in chains or not at all. They scoured the tobacco fields until the stalks shredded beneath the hooves of their horses. They sent bloodhounds into the black tangles of swamp where cypress knees jutted like the bones of some ancient beast. Each day, they returned with nothing but mud on their boots and a deeper frustration carved into their faces. Post-riders spread the alarm far beyond the county. By the second week, Isaac's name was whispered in taverns as far south as the Carolinas and west toward the Blue Ridge. Handbills appeared on courthouse doors and church bulletin boards promising a reward that grew larger with each fruitless day, $50, then $100, then $200, enough to tempt poor farmers and professional bounty hunters alike. The broadsides described him in cold detail: medium height, muscular, scar across the right palm, last seen wearing a coarse linen shirt, stained dark at the cuffs. Yet the descriptions never seemed to match the rumors. For in those rumors, Isaac was many things at once: taller, broader, able to vanish like mist when cornered. Slave catchers arrived in 2s and 3s, lean men with scarred faces and packs of baying dogs. They rode with muskets across their saddles and a quiet hunger in their eyes. They pushed through pine forests, waded through marsh water up to their waists, questioned every black man they met on the road, sometimes with words, often with the butt of a rifle. Some swore they caught a scent, a broken branch here, a damp footprint there, but the trail always ended in silence. It was as if the land itself conspired to keep Isaac hidden. Among the enslaved, a different story was taking shape. Night meetings in hidden clearings turned Isaac into something more than a man. Around smoldering fires, elders told of a figure who could slip through walls, who walked barefoot across frozen rivers without leaving a mark, who carried a butcher's cleaver that sang when it tasted blood. For people who had endured generations of unpunished cruelty, the tale offered a dangerous comfort. Someone among them had struck back and survived. Children whispered his name like a charm. Men and women hummed songs whose lyrics shifted with each retelling, sometimes a hymn of praise, sometimes a warning. White planters heard those songs and trembled. They doubled the night patrols, tightened the slave codes, forbade gatherings after dusk. In every creak of the floorboards they heard footsteps. In every gust of wind they imagined the swing of a cleaver. Letters from Richmond to Charleston carried a single refrain. If one man could do this, others might follow. Weeks stretched into months. Winter rains turned roads into rivers of muck. But the search did not slow. A party of hunters claimed to have cornered Isaac near the Great Dismal Swamp. They said they found his cooking fire still warm and a half-eaten piece of cornbread beside it. Others swore he boarded a schooner on the James River, disguised as a deckhand, and sailed north toward freedom. Each rumor conflicted with the next, but all of them kept the fear alive. Newspapers fed that fear with fevered headlines. One Richmond paper described him as the Phantom Butcher, a creature half man, half demon. Another insisted he had an army of runaways gathering in the woods, ready to descend on plantations in a wave of fire. The editors knew a profitable story when they saw one, and Isaac provided endless copy. Readers devoured every update, true or not, until the facts blurred beyond recognition. Meanwhile, the people who had known him, the ones forced to work the fields beside him, to share the bitter meals of bondage, spoke of him more quietly. To them, Isaac remained flesh and blood, a man who once hummed work songs under his breath, who laughed only rarely but listened to every sound around him. They remembered the scar on his palm from a butcher's knife, the way he studied the overseer's routines without appearing to watch. Some believed he had slipped west into the mountains, where maroon communities of free black families sheltered those who escaped. A few claimed to have seen him in the deep woods at night, a flash of movement between trees, a glint of steel that vanished before a word could be spoken. The legend grew until it no longer belonged to the county or even to Virginia. In port cities, sailors told of a silent man who stowed away on ships and disappeared into northern alleys. In the Mississippi Delta field, hands swore a stranger had passed through, teaching the words of rebellion before melting into the swamp. Each tale added new powers. He could change his face, command the weather, call animals to his side. Isaac the Butcher became a symbol that frightened and inspired in equal measure, proof that one act of defiance could ripple across an entire nation. Sheriff Harlan never gave up entirely. Well into spring, he rode the back roads at dusk, scanning the tree lines for a flicker of movement. Some said the failure aged him faster than hard liquor, that he carried the sound of that first scream in his head until his dying day. He never found Isaac, and perhaps that was the final victory. Years later, when the Civil War finally tore the old order apart, veterans of those hunts would speak in low voices of the winter when a single man eluded them all. Younger listeners leaned closer, caught between disbelief and wonder. Was Isaac a murderer, a freedom fighter, or a ghost? No one could say. But the story endured because it answered a secret yearning, the idea that even in the darkest corner of oppression, someone could break the chain and simply walk away, leaving only fear and legend behind. By the time those who had known him were long buried, the name Isaac the Butcher belonged as much to folklore as to history. Children played games where they pretended to be him, slipping unseen through the woods. Preachers invoked him as a cautionary tale of vengeance, while others held him up as a sign that justice sometimes comes from unexpected hands. Whether he died in a lonely swamp or lived to see freedom in the north no longer mattered. What mattered was the story, carried on the wind like the faint ring of a cleaver in the dark, reminding every generation that the night can still belong to those who refuse to bow. Night after night, the rumors kept their slow burn. Some said Isaac had crossed into the Carolinas. Others swore he hid in the Blue Ridge Hollows with hunters too poor to care about reward money. Then, in the chill of early spring, a rider thundered into the county seat with news that set every bell ringing. A man matching Isaac's description had been spotted near the Pamunkey River, half-starved and moving under cover of darkness. Sheriff Harlan rode out before dawn with a posse of 12 men and 2 hounds. They cut through woods soaked with fog, following a trail of snapped twigs and faint boot prints until the ground turned to marsh. The dogs caught scent near a tangle of cypress and let loose a howl that shivered through the trees. Lanterns swung like fireflies as the men spread in a ragged circle. A whippoorwill called once, twice, and then the bushes erupted. Isaac broke from cover like a shadow made flesh, barefoot and gaunt, but still fast as a deer. Muskets flared. Shot hissed through the branches. He dove into black water and vanished beneath the reeds. The posse gave chase, mud sucking at their boots, dogs lunging and snarling. For long moments there was only the splash of bodies, the echo of curses. Then one hound bayed sharp and sudden. A deputy's lantern found him crouched on a fallen log, the butcher's cleaver still at his belt, eyes burning like coals in the smoky light. They dragged him out with musket stocks and rope, and though blood ran from a cut at his temple, he did not struggle. Witnesses later swore he stood straighter than any of the men around him, silent as they bound his wrists. Like arresting the night itself, one farmer muttered. The ride back to the county seat took hours, the posse spooked by every groan of the forest, as if the woods might rise to reclaim the man they'd stolen. News of the capture spread faster than the wind. By the time they reached the jail, crowds jammed the square. Planters, merchants, curious onlookers, mothers clutching children who craned for a glimpse of the killer turned legend. Some hissed and spat as Isaac passed, others fell quiet, watching the man they'd heard described as a demon and finding only a thin, dark-skinned figure who would not lower his gaze. The trial was arranged almost immediately, more spectacle than proceeding. The courthouse was swept and scrubbed, benches dragged in from neighboring churches to hold the swelling audience. The judge arrived in a black coat smelling of camphor, a Bible tucked beneath one arm as if to remind the room of holy order. Isaac was given a lawyer in name only, a young clerk who never spoke except to nod. Witnesses took the stand. The overseer who found the bodies, the deputies who had chased Isaac through the swamp, a trembling woman who claimed she heard him singing a hymn as he swung the cleaver. Each told their piece, the crowd leaning forward at every grisly detail. Outside, printers worked their presses until midnight, setting type for special editions that would carry the story to Richmond and beyond. When the judge finally asked whether the accused wished to speak, the room held its breath. For a long moment, Isaac remained still, eyes fixed on a point beyond the ceiling beams. Then he lifted his head. His voice, when it came, was low but carried to the back of the gallery. "I was born in chains," he said. "I cut them the only way left to me." Gasps rippled like wind through wheat. The judge banged his gavel for order, but the words lingered long after the echo died. The prosecutor moved quickly to end the performance. Within the hour, the jury, 12 white men, most plantation owners themselves, filed out and returned with the inevitable verdict. Guilty of murder, guilty of insurrection. Sentence, death by hanging at first light 2 days hence. Those 2 days turned the county into a pilgrimage site. Strangers arrived from distant towns. Hawkers sold cider and meat pies beside the courthouse. Preachers thundered sermons on vengeance and divine justice. Yet a different murmur ran through the enslaved quarters. They spoke of Isaac as if he were already a spirit, uncatchable even in chains. Mothers whispered his name to children at bedtime like a promise. Someone had fought back. They buried Isaac outside the town limits in a patch of clay so poor it could barely cradle a pine root. No headstone marked the spot, only a rough cross of branches that the next rain carried downstream. The sheriff thought that anonymity would finish the story, that the ground itself would swallow his name. But the soil has a way of remembering what people try to forget. Among the enslaved, the legend took root before the grave cooled. On plantations from the Tidewater to the Appalachian foothills, night gatherings became quiet memorials. Field hands sang work songs laced with new verses, lines that spoke of a butcher's cleaver flashing like moonlight, of a man who walked unbound through the darkest woods. The lyrics shifted from county to county, but the rhythm carried the same promise. One day the chain would break. Mothers hummed the tune while rocking infants, letting the melody slip into tiny ears as a bedtime prayer. Children played at being Isaac, slipping between trees and vanishing into the night, imagining freedom just beyond the next hill. Stories multiplied as they traveled. Some said Isaac's body was never truly captured, that the man who swung from the gallows was a decoy while the real Isaac watched from the crowd. Others claimed he rose 3 days later, footprints glowing faintly in the dirt. Around campfires, people whispered that he could become a fox or a hawk when danger approached, that his spirit roamed the swamps teaching fugitives how to hide. Fact and faith braided together until the difference hardly mattered. White society, meanwhile, told a very different story. Newspapers turned him into a cautionary monster, the Butcher of Virginia, a savage whose violence proved the need for harsher slave codes. Editorials warned planters to keep their servants under stricter watch, to ban night meetings and religious gatherings, to punish small acts of defiance before they grew into bloodshed. Preachers thundered from pulpits that Isaac's rampage was the devil's work, a sign that God demanded obedience and the lash. Legislators in Richmond passed new laws forbidding literacy among the enslaved, fearing that words themselves might breed rebellion. Yet even in their fear, the oppressors could not control the tale. Merchants repeated it in taverns to startle travelers. Sailors carried it down the coast, their accounts laced with exaggeration. The butcher who vanished in smoke, the phantom who wielded a blade of pure silver. By the time the story reached New Orleans, it had become a ghost yarn told to wide-eyed children, a southern cousin to the headless horseman. The name Isaac the Butcher, meant as a curse, turned into something else, a riddle that no law could quite silence. As the decades rolled toward civil war, abolitionists seized the legend for their own purposes. Northern newspapers reprinted fragments of the story, portraying Isaac not as a fiend, but as a man driven to the ultimate protest. Pamphlets distributed at anti-slavery rallies hinted that his defiance exposed the brutality of the system itself. Some speakers compared him to the freedom fighters of Haiti, proof that even in the heart of the American South, the desire for liberty burned hot enough to strike fear into every master. After emancipation, the tale shifted again. Freed families kept the songs alive, weaving Isaac's name into spirituals and work chants. Storytellers along the James River told of a man who refused to die, whose spirit walked beside the newly freed as they searched for lost relatives and carved out lives from the ashes of war. Grandmothers recited his deeds as lessons in courage, not to glorify the blood, but to remind the young that freedom had a price. In the early 20th century, collectors of folklore began writing down these stories, surprised at how far they had spread. They found versions in Carolina fishing villages, in Alabama, logging camps, even in black communities in Chicago and Detroit where migrants carried Southern memories north. Each retelling bore local flavor. Some made Isaac a conjure man, others a soldier in disguise, but all held the same unyielding core. A man who struck back when every path to justice was closed. Meanwhile, the white South tried to domesticate the legend into morality play. Regional writers folded him into Gothic tales where the rebellious slave inevitably met divine punishment. Tourist pamphlets turned the old courthouse into a haunted attraction, promising visitors the echo of phantom footsteps. But the truer stories, the ones told in kitchens and backyards, passed from mouth to ear, remained stubbornly alive, immune to varnish. By the time the civil rights movement gathered steam, Isaac's name surfaced in speeches and pamphlets as an ancestral voice of resistance. Young activists invoked him alongside Nat Turner and Harriet Tubman, a reminder that the fight for dignity had deep roots. Musicians worked his story into blues verses and later into jazz and hip-hop, a low thrum of defiance that spanned generations. Today, historians still debate how much of the record is verifiable and how much is myth. Court transcripts exist but are fragmentary. Newspaper accounts contradict one another. Perhaps Isaac was one man. Perhaps he was many. His story a composite of rebellions both remembered and forgotten. Yet in a sense, the accuracy no longer matters. What endured was the echo, the idea that even the most oppressed could seize a single night and bend it to their will. Walk through the county now and you will find no monument, no tidy plaque. The old plantation house rotted long ago. The courthouse rebuilt with polished stone. But on certain evenings, when the fog rolls in from the river, locals claim to hear a faint metallic ring, like a butcher's knife drawn across a whetstone, and a low hum of an old work song carried on the wind. Whether it is memory, myth, or something beyond either, it reminds anyone who listens that Isaac the butcher never truly left. The courthouse square is quieter now. Cars hum along the bypass, and the old jailhouse stands in careful restoration, its brickwork scrubbed of soot and age. Tourists drift through with cameras, reading plaques that speak of complex times and troubling events. No marker names Isaac. No plaque recounts the night a man once turned a butcher's knife into a declaration of freedom. Yet when the light falls a certain way across the worn stone, it is impossible not to wonder what lingers beneath the asphalt and manicured lawns. Isaac's legend endures because it forces a reckoning. To the people who inherited his story, descendants of the enslaved, activists, artists, he remains more than a footnote. He is a challenge to the tidy narrative of gradual progress, a reminder that liberation rarely arrives through polite petition. His act was brutal, yes, but it was also a cry from someone denied every legal and human avenue of justice. In a society built on sanctioned violence, how do we measure the morality of striking back? Modern audiences grapple with that question in a world still scarred by racial inequity. Police shootings, mass incarceration, and the quiet persistence of economic segregation echo the old hierarchies. Isaac's refusal to submit speaks to those who march in protest or kneel in silence, who demand that systems built on exploitation finally answer for their crimes. His legend is not a call to bloodshed. It is a mirror held up to power, asking what desperation is born when justice is indefinitely delayed. Artists and scholars revisit his tale with fresh urgency. Painters depict him as a shadowy sentinel, half man and half myth. Playwrights stage his final hours, giving voice to the anguish history tried to erase. Historians comb fragile documents to separate fact from folklore, yet many admit the truth is larger than any archive. The power of Isaac's story lies not in verification, but in its resonance. A single life expanded into a parable of resistance. In classrooms, teachers pose the uncomfortable questions his legend raises. Was Isaac a murderer or a freedom fighter? Can morality be absolute when the law itself is immoral? Students debate, their voices catching on the tension between empathy and fear. Some argue that violence only begets violence. Others counter that centuries of sanctioned brutality left no peaceful path. The discussion reveals how alive the dilemma remains, how each generation must decide where justice ends and rebellion begins. What then is Isaac's legacy for us today? Perhaps it is the warning that systems built on exploitation will always invite rebellion, whether in the cotton fields of the 19th century or the city streets of the 21st. Perhaps it is the reminder that heroes are rarely pure, that the fight for dignity often demands choices that defy simple morality. Or perhaps it is simply the enduring truth that no authority can fully silence a story once it takes root in collective memory. As dusk settles over the courthouse, imagine the unseen layers of history beneath your feet. The hurried footsteps of fugitives, the muted cries from the jail cell, the hum of a song that survived centuries. The legend of Isaac asks each passerby to confront an uneasy question. When justice is impossible, what would you do? Would you endure, waiting for a freedom promised but never delivered? Or would you seize a single night, knowing history might brand you villain or savior? The fog thickens and the present blurs with the past. Perhaps you hear a faint metallic ring, like steel drawn across stone. Perhaps it is only your heartbeat. Either way, the echo remains. Isaac's story is not over because the struggle it represents is not over. Until justice is more than an aspiration, until the powerful reckon honestly with the past, his shadow will walk beside us, reminding us that resistance, in all its complexity, is the language of the unheard.